Paul Mauser. Hey guys, Extremely Average Man here, and in the eyes of some, this is one extremely average rifle. Now, many European nations leading up to and after World War II have adopted the Model of 98 rifle in some capacity or another. Even some Western nations have. Looking at you, 1903 Springfield. Now, the Mauser 98 is one of the most produced and or copied rifles of all time, and that's largely attributed to Paul Mauser's excellent bolt design with the twin locking lugs and just its legacy of being just unbreakable. Very durable bolt design that's still being produced and copied in hunting rifles and sporting rifles even to this day. Now, this particular rifle is a 1943 K98 Mauser with some interesting and some storied history to it that we'll get into here shortly. So stick around and I'll be showcasing this rifle. Alright, so now we'll talk about the history of this rifle. And I'll warn you guys, if you're not comfortable discussing the dark part of Germany throughout this time, being forced labor, concentration camps, I fully understand if you don't want to follow further. But for those of you that want to hear about the history of this rifle and maybe if it sort of pertains to yours as well, we'll go ahead and dive right in. So this rifle is stamped the BNZ 1943, and the BNZ, that's the code for the Steyr Daimler Puch plants, the big Steyr plant there in Austria that Germany annexed, I believe 1940. Early in the war. And I'll go ahead and just read kind of what went on there at the Steyr plant during that time frame. So when it comes to forced labor, it was kind of between like March of 42 basically to the end of the war. I think May 5th of 1945 is when the U.S. Army actually liberated much of that region, including the Steyr plant, Mauthausen, some of the Gusen concentration camps in the area. But we'll dive into Steyr here. So after 1938, the company Steyr Daimler Puch AG grows into the largest arms manufacturer on Austrian territory. In 1941, it builds, amongst others, an airplane engine works to which a prisoner detachment is sent daily from Mauthausen concentration camp. We'll get into that in a minute. In March of 42, a separate subcamp is created for the concentration camp prisoners. Prisoners are put to work producing ball bearings and airplane engines, constructing air raid shelters and tunnels, and clearing rubble after air raids. In early 1942, 300 prisoners, most of them Spanish, start to build the camp. The total number of those imprisoned here is not known. At the end of 1944, 2,000 people are in concentration camp imprisonment in Steyr. They come from the Soviet Union, Poland, Yugoslavia, Spain, and France. After the disbandment of the subcamps in eastern Austria, the number rises to over 3,000. At least 295 prisoners die in Steyr. Their corpses are burned in the municipal crematorium in Steyr. The prisoners are housed in a barrack camp in the Munichholz district at the town of Steyr. The head of camp from August 1943 to May 1945 is SS Obersturmführer Otto Hess. In later court trials, members of the SS and prisoner functionaries are either sentenced to death or to long prison sentences. And on May 5th of 1945, U.S. troops finally liberate the Steyr Munichholz camp. Sorry for these rough pronunciations. So, interesting history. I'm sure as Russia, started to approach the Austrian border, all the slave labor kind of got dumped into the more western camps there. And I'm sure the bombings, I wonder if that was daylight bombings from the 8th Air Force, or were those the night British raids, or were they other bombings? Interesting how all the history kind of gets tied in here. We'll talk about the Mauthausen concentration camp a bit, as well as the Goosen camp and maybe some of the other sub-camps in the area, because they all kind of tie together. The Steyr plants contract a lot of work out, understandably. There's a lot of forced free prison work, with all these concentration camps. So I know the Mauthausen got quite a few contracts, as well as the Goosen camp. So we'll touch on that here in a little bit. This is a wonderful website. It's the Mauthausen Memorial website. I'll link it below in the description for you guys to check out. But you can tell whoever, the team that designed this did a wonderful job. A lot of love and respect of laying out the history of not only the Mauthausen concentration camp, but also all the sub-camps that are tied to it. So you can see here the red icons, the main Mauthausen concentration camp there in Mauthausen. Correct me, guys. This is the Danube River. And all the sub-camps that are tied to it are these little green icons. As you zoom out, you can just see they're littered all over Austria, a little bit in Slovenia, and just kind of the surrounding region. But as it pertains to the rifle, so you can see down here at Steyr, there's also a sub-camp here. I believe that was the one that was constructed in early 42, because leading up to that, they would actually take train cars of prisoners from the Mauthausen concentration camp, deliver them by rail down to the Steyr plant. It's a distance of about 30 kilometers or about 18 miles to work in the factories for the day before they would cart them back to the Mauthausen plant. I'm sure as the war progressed and not only time, resources, and efficiency became more and more dire. I'm sure those were big reasons to create a camp here to house the Steyr plant laborers. So now I'll go ahead and read about the Mauthausen concentration camp. This is straight from the Memorial website, and it's certainly worth a read. Of course, Mauthausen's the big main concentration camp in the area that they were pulling prisoners from to go work at the Steyr plant, just 30 kilometers south. So, so excuse my lack of German pronunciation as I struggled through a few of these words, but here we go. On the 12th of March 1938, the Anschluss annexation of Austro-Fascist Austria to the German Reich took place. 2 weeks later, the National Socialist Gauleiter, or the regional head of Upper Austria, August E. Gruber, announced to an enthusiastic audience that his Gau would have the distinction of building a concentration camp. The location chosen was the town of Mauthausen on the Danube. Political opponents and groups of people labeled as criminal or antisocial would be imprisoned here and forced to work in the granite quarries. On the 8th of August 1938, the SS transferred the first prisoners from the Dachau concentration camp. During this phase, the prisoners, who were all Germans and Austrians and also all men, had to build their own camp and set up operations in the quarry. Their daily lives were shaped by hunger, arbitrary treatment, and violence. In December of 1939, the SS ordered the construction of a second concentration camp just a few kilometers from Mauthausen. This would be the Goosen camp. The Goosen branch camp officially went into operation May 1940. After the outbreak of the war, people from across Europe were deported to Mauthausen, which gradually developed into a system of several interconnected camps. During this phase, Mauthausen and Goosen were the concentration camps with the harshest imprisonment conditions and the highest mortality. Prisoners at the bottom of the camp hierarchy had barely any chance of surviving for long. Those who were ill or deemed useless to the SS were in constant danger of their lives. In 1941, the SS started to construct a gas chamber and other installations at Mauthausen for the systematic murder of large groups of people. So, the initial couple years of this concentration camp is basically a death camp. You know, work them as hard as possible and until they die, essentially. And 42, 43 is kind of when you see the switch, when they go from systematically killing people to, hey, we're starting to lose the war, we need laborers more than anything. So this is kind of where you see that switch happening. During the second half of the war, the prisoners, who now included women for the first time, were increasingly used as forced laborers in the arms industry. In order to accommodate the prisoners where they worked, the SS established several subcamps. Newly arrived prisoners were transferred to these camps from the main camp. More and more, Mauthausen itself became a camp where the sick and weak were sent to die. Since the prisoners were now needed for their labor, living conditions improved for a short time. From the end of 1943 onwards, inmates were also deployed in the construction of underground factories. For example, those in Melk, Ebensee, and St. Gorgon on der Gusen. The murderous working conditions that prevailed at these sites soon led to a dramatic rise in the number of victims. Towards the end of the war, the Mauthausen concentration camp became the destination for evacuations from camps near the front line. Tens of thousands of prisoners arrived on several large transports. Overcrowding, lack of food, and rampant disease led to the mass death among the prisoners in the final months before liberation. So I'm sure as the Eastern Front was closing in, and the Russians were starting to develop the far eastern camps. You know, I'm sure this happened in many of the main camps, but you know, the classic, the guards left hours before, you know, the Russians or Americans liberated the camp. You know, all those prisoners are just kind of being shoved into the remaining camps that are still under the Third Reich control. On May 5th, 1945, the U.S. Army reached Busen and Mauthausen. Some prisoners were in such a weakened state that many still died in the days and weeks after liberation. Of a total of around 190,000 people imprisoned in the Mauthausen concentration camp and its subcamps over 7 years, at least 90,000 died. So going back to the receiver stamp there, BNZ, of course, Steyr factory, 1943. So with all that history in mind, I don't know serial number wise, since this is not matching whatsoever. It's quite a mismatch. You know, this rifle was put together, you know, sometime kind of during that switch of 43 when, you know, these camps started basically going from forced labor death camps into just work camps for the arms industry, since Germany was now losing the war and needed as many arms and people working in the factories as possible. So, other German markings found on this rifle, these are known as Waffenamps. They're German inspection proof markings. They're usually the Nazi eagle with the swastika. There's one right here above the BNZ code. Can't really make it out, but it's WAA something. I don't know if it got scratched off or what. Here's another one below that's actually been peened out or punched out with the punch. We'll get to that in a minute. However, on the other side of the receiver, you can actually read this one. WAA 623. And there's also another one that's found kind of on the side of the barrel. Let's see if I can get this in frame. If you can read that one. WAA 77. We'll get to those here in a minute. This is another good website that I found. Was it militariatoday.com? But it explains the Waffenamps, and with that, you learn the date, the factory, other sorts of data of some of the markings on a rifle. So, with that first one, the WAA 77, let's scroll down to it. So right here, you have the code, you have the item, you have the manufacturer, company location, and then you have the date over here. So WAA 77, looks like a few things were made with that code. So right here matches up. BNZ, which is on the receiver, Kar98K, Steyr, Daimler, Puch, and yep, 41 to 44. So that explains that proof mark anyway. And the second one was WAA623. Commence a little bit more scrolling. Ooh, all right, 623. So it's going to be right in here. There we go. Yep, BNZ factory, Kar98. So there you go. Sometime between 40 and 45, it received that proof mark as well. Probably 43. As Russia pushed the retreating Germans all the way back to Germany, and upon winning the Second World War, Russia ended up with millions of Kar98s. What did they do with them? Well, they supplied their own reserves and their own stockpiles with Kar98s, especially with the Cold War looming in the distance. They also sent boatloads of these to Russia's allied nations. Interestingly enough, during the Vietnam conflict, American troops would face off with North Vietnamese as well as Chinese soldiers armed with the old Kar98. I would say there's about 4 or 5 telltale signs if you have a Russian captured Kar98 or not. Going back to the end of the Second World War, when Russia ended up with millions of these rifles, before they stockpiled them into their warehouses for the future, obviously they had to inspect them and make sure they were still battle ready. You may have seen some photos of these inspectors with just thousands of Kar98s just laying on top of each other. What they would actually do they would have thousands of these rifles, and they would strip them, clean them, inspect them, and if they saw a part that they didn't deem acceptable, they would just throw it out. But they would have just a pile of bolts over here, pile of firing pins, pile of stocks, pile of floor plates. And once they put them back together, the Russians didn't even bother about matching the parts. You know, they would pull the barrel from over here and just slap it on the stock from this pile over here. They didn't care about matching whatsoever. But once they did assemble a rifle and cycle it, maybe fire it a few times, make sure it worked, we'll get to our first point here. Many people call this the Russian capture mark, or a little X that's on the barrel here. It's not exactly a capture mark. When the Russians would put these back together, it's actually 2 rifles leaning against one another, and it seemed like battle ready. You know, it's kind of their inspection mark. Hey, we looked over the rifle, it's battle ready. So along with the Russian 2 rifles battle ready inspection mark on here, the Russians would also do what's called a force match. And since they assembled these rifles with largely mismatching parts, they would just take an electro pencil, and on many of the parts they would kind of like force their own serial number. You can kind of think of it like that. So the one they use on mine, it's in 3 places. It's on the bolt, it's on the stock, and I also have one on the floor plate. So my number is 7881. So whatever original German serial number was originally for the bolt and the floor plate and the stock, it's, you know, according to Russia, it's now 7881. Oh yeah, I also have, it's not an electro pencil, but it looks like they took a punch or something and put 7881 pretty crudely also on the receiver. So another pretty obvious Russian capture sign on your rifle is, I believe most, maybe all, maybe most of the metal on the Kar98 should have been blued. Germans use bluing. When part of the refinishing, I don't know if it's a parkerized coating or something else, but it's more of a black finish across all the metal, which, yeah, mine's definitely darker. Also, on your rear sight post, I believe the Germans originally like all the elevation numbers on there should be white, but with the black refinishing that the Russians would put on this, it just ends up being all kind of blacked out. Some other things to note on a lot of the Waffenants, the little Nazi flag, as well as the German eagle coat of arms. A lot of times the Russians would take a punch. It's called peening it out. So they would take a punch on the Nazi flag and peen it out, which mine, it is in a couple places. That's peened out, that's peened out. That one, for whatever reason, is not peened out. But again, I don't know if that's a pride thing or just a declaration that this is no longer a German rifle, it's now a Russian rifle, or, you know, I'm not exactly sure the reasoning behind it, but to me it makes sense. Oftentimes, when they were disassembling and assembling these rifles, they would also either toss away or just not put back the front side hood. Oftentimes the cleaning rod would be missing, and the set screws that are in the floor plate are often missing as well. Fortunately, mine has the set screw and the cleaning rod, but I'm just missing the front sight post. Not a huge deal. I have another Mauser that does have the front sight post. I mean, I don't really see it as a big deal. If this were like a duty rifle or a go-to rifle, maybe I'd like to protect the front sight, but you know, I really only shoot this on occasion, so it's not really a big deal for me. And one other thing to note, sometimes the Russians, if the stocks were in rough shape, they would put just a really cheap and kind of crappy looking shellac finish on the stock, which fortunately mine doesn't have. But mine is a laminate stock, and it has a little bit of sheen to it. I'm guessing that's original. It looks pretty good. Also, pretty interesting on my rifle, since I have a 43 receiver. However, and this must have happened when the Russians were, you know, just part spin, throwing the parts back on this rifle to make it complete. I have a flat butt plate. I believe the Germans stopped doing that and went to a cupped butt plate, like 41, sometime in 1941 onwards. So, as far as I can see, this is an older stock that got thrown onto my rifle. But interesting to note. See if we can hit that steel with these last three. Yeah, it's hitting way high. Now we're on. There we go. Well, there you go. There's 45 rounds through my 43 BNZ Mauser. Things I've concluded, I'm pretty awful shooting this thing. You really have to bury that front sight post deep within the rear beaver. This thing likes to shoot high. I suppose it's adjustable. I mean, this thing is all the way down though at about, what is that, 100 meters? So that's fine. I've got two of these Mausers. The other one shoots pretty much right on. This one I always have to remind myself that it shoots quite high, so you just got to bear that front sight. But overall, this really wasn't about my proficiency with it. In theory, I need a lot of work, but it's not my go-to rifle. I bring this out, a few times a year just to enjoy, or if I have friends that want to go to the range, and it's like, hey, you want to, I'll grab my M1 Grand and Mauser, can shoot some historical rifles, because, I mean, these are just such a blast to shoot. Just so much fun, and it really is, just putting yourself in the mindset of the men back in the day who shot these, and, the allies who are on the receiving end of them. So, anyways, hope you enjoyed that terrible range footage, but I'm just out here having fun, so be critical if you want, but, I don't train with this rifle or anything, so it's just fun to bring out and shoot, and for you guys to enjoy as well. So, all in all, 12 to 15 million people were forced into labor under the abusive and watchful eye of the Third Reich, involving men and women from over 20 countries, which constituted for about 20% of the German labor force throughout the war. "Work will set you free" was the slogan often attached to the main gate of many concentration camps as the prisoners arrived, often by cramped and primitive boxcars or cattle cars. They would be abused, starved, and worked to death doing various tasks for the German war effort, and in the case of my rifle, at the Steyr plant, which forced prisoners to manufacture arms, automobile, and aircraft parts. Although I've read individual stories of it happening, and I know it did occur, I couldn't really find any concrete statistics showing to the extent that it occurred, but sabotage was prevalent within factories and arms productions. However, the penalty was very severe. It was basically a guaranteed death sentence, and not only for yourself, but perhaps to the 10 workers next to you as well, where they would take you out back and shoot you or hang you and use you as an example for the other prisoners. There's several ways you can sabotage a rifle, but one of the very common ways was to improperly heat treat the critical metal components of the rifle, being the bolt, the barrel, and the chamber. Either you heat the metal way too much and it becomes brittle, or you don't heat it enough and it becomes very soft. This is a good way to cause a catastrophic malfunction once that rifle reaches the front and is in the hands of a German soldier. The hope for these workers was that once a round was fired, perhaps the chamber or the bolt would essentially grenade itself in front of the soldier, causing serious injury or even death. Again, sabotage was an extremely risky endeavor. Many of these factories were under the extremely hawkish eyes of SS guards. So it was not only a death sentence if they caught you in the act sabotaging a rifle, but let's say perhaps the faulty rifle did pass the manufacturing process. There's still a good chance that that rifle could get scooped up in a batch of rifles used for quality control. And if they found a few rifles that were faulty, you would be lucky to leave with a beating. I happened to pick up this rifle. Actually, I have the receipt right here. February 22nd of 2020. I was with my friend at a shooting range that he had a membership at. And it was at the end of the range session where we're just chit-chatting with the cashiers. And my friend goes off. They have like a separate room that has just a lot of used guns. And my friend comes back over and was like, "Hey, I think they have a Mauser back there. I know you're into Mausers." I had one prior Mauser at this point, so I was somewhat familiar with them. And I go in the room, and sure as shit, it's a German. I knew enough to know it was a German Kar98. And two things kind of struck me. Not only the price, here's the tag it came with, which even for Russian captures, I don't think this price even exists anymore. But it had another interesting tag. It had this red one right here. It says collector's item, and then not safe for regular use. And it kind of came off as a red flag, or in this case, a red tag. But not enough to warrant me to actually ask what that red tag was for. I was thinking, okay, maybe it's just like a World War II, they don't want people shooting it. But until I got home, it kind of dawned on me, like, okay, maybe I should actually call them and ask, further the conversation why they put that tag on there. And as the guy on the phone was telling me, he told me briefly, but he said that the factory that this rifle was produced, in this case the BNZ, the Steyr factory, used a lot of forced labor, and in his words, he said there was a lot of sabotage at that camp. Which, look, I know there's individual stories of sabotage, and we hear it from time to time, but I really do think it's one of those things that kind of got blown out of proportion. I don't think it happened as frequently as people make it out to be, again, because there's the penalties of being caught were so severe. I kind of took the risk. I was thinking about taking this into a gunsmith to have it looked over, but just looking at the metallurgy and looking at the condition of it, it's in real good shape. I just decided to take it to the range, and here we are over 3 years later, and I've put several hundred rounds through this rifle, and it's built like a tank. So, I understand, and as coming from a gun store and having that liability, I'm sure he was just kind of covering his base too. But it's proven to be a rifle that shoots just fine, and it's held up all right through the years. Now, with all that said, what does this rifle mean to me? Well, like I've said, I bought one Mauser prior to this just because these rifles are probably the quintessential bolt-action rifle. Certainly from the Second World War, and just in any bolt-action camp. I mean, you can't talk about bolt-action rifles without talking about the Mauser. So I have an M2452C that I bought prior to this one that I love to shoot, and the lore of having a Second World War, not only for the history, but having like a true Mauser, that's, in my eyes, that's kind of how I saw it. I'd always wanted one, and the opportunity was there to pick one up, and it really wasn't until owning one that I found out just the amount of history that came with this. And I think that's what's neat. The gentleman from Mauser World's YouTube channel even mentions this too. Russian captures, they're neat. They're never going to fetch the money that a true German numbers matching Kar98 will fetch, and that's fine. Everything's mismatched. They're thrown back together. But the fact that they're a Russian capture, and their story didn't end with the Second World War. In fact, it went on, and that's just what's cool with anything historical, right? It's narrowing down the history, and you're never going to get it 100% correct. But that's kind of the interesting part about it. It's like the mystique. And I've learned so much just about really the dark side of the Second World War II. Not only concentration camps, but like about the sub camps, about like what actually went on there, means and methods and stuff I would have never really dove into if it weren't for owning this. And that's what history is. For better or for worse, history is truly the greatest teacher. You take away and hold on to the good things you learn, and the bad side of history you better remember so you don't make the same mistakes. I guarantee this rifle will never harm another human being. It will just be used for pleasure at the range, and for my friends and family to shoot as well, and hopefully this legacy goes on, and you know, hopefully we never forget about you know, the dark side of the Second World War and why we fought it. This rifle is not only a joy to shoot, but it embodies that as well. So I will be keeping this rifle. This will certainly be my rifle for hopefully many more years, and hopefully with that I can tell its story to many more eager ears. So that's all I've got today, guys. Thank you so much. This is really the story of my 43 BNZ rifle. There's many like it. I hope this piqued your interest too if you own a Second World War Mauser, perhaps even a Russian capture, and maybe this kind of stoked your interest in yours as well, into doing a deep dive. So again, I'll post some of those websites below for your own knowledge. Thanks so much for watching. I'm an extremely average man, and right now I'm gonna go to bed. Have a good night, guys. We'll see you on the next one.